occasional talk. It's not part of a series. It's just on the occasion of our alumnus, Anthony Medrano, being back in town. We're happy to see him. I'm thrilled that he's willing to share his work with us. I'd like to thank a few people. This event is organized by the Department of Asian Studies, but co-sponsored by the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, Miriam Stark, Director, the Center for Pacific Island Studies and the Department of Pacific Island Studies, Alex Moyer, Director, but he's very sad to be out of town, and the Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs. Mr. Govella in the back of the room is the director of that center. So thanks to all those organizations for helping co-sponsor this great event. So Dr. Anthony Medrano is the Presidential Young Professor of Environmental Studies at Yale-NUS College in Singapore, and a faculty member in the NUS Department of History. His teaching and research examine how the histories and legacies of economic life, scientific practice, and biodiversity research have shaped our understandings of Southeast Asia today, particularly as a region of megacities and hotspots. He's the editor of Lala-Land, not the movie, Singapore's Seafood Heritage, forthcoming, and co-editor with Nicole Aboitz CoUnjieng of a special Philippine-focused issue of the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, also forthcoming. He's completing his first book, The Edible Ocean, Science, Industry, and the Rise of Urban Southeast Asia, which is under contract with Yale University Press. His degrees are from Humboldt, Hawaii, MA, and Wisconsin for his PhD. So I'll just introduce, I'll turn it over to Anthony in a minute. I'll just let you know, he'll talk for 40, I didn't tell him how long to talk for.
I'm going to do it for like 35 minutes.
35 minutes, we'll have Q&A, and then we have some wine and cheese and fish-related and fish-related products for consumption, a little reception afterwards so we can talk. Okay. And without further ado, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you
Please
very much.
Please join me in welcoming Dr. Medrano.
Thanks so much. It's great to see so many friends and people I've known over my whole life, it seems like. I spent a big chunk of that life here in Hawaii, getting degrees and teaching and really just having a lot of fun, but also growing up. And it's really wonderful to be back. Could we maybe
we're trying to figure out that one.
Perfect. So thank you. I mean, fish, it sort of impacts and affects people in lots of different ways. And I've got a story here that I think tries to connect where my heart is, which is in Southeast Asia, with where I kind of had my formative years, which is Hawaii and the larger Indo-Pacific. So I'm going to try to do that through a story of this fish here, ikan mujair. And just from this picture alone, there's a lot of stuff that I think is quite interesting. One, the name mujair, which I'll get into. The other name, Peters, Tilapia mozambica. Arifin, the artist, the Indonesian artist who did the drawing. And the drawing is from 1950. Okay, so I'm going to just, I think, dive into it. So as fishes go, cichlids abound, and they do so like nothing else in nature. Based on some of the most recent taxonomic literature, scientists estimate that there are between 2,000 and 3,000 species of cichlids, making the Cichlidae family one of the largest fish families in our biodiverse world. In Singapore, where I live, they're everywhere. Cichlids are in the drains, canals, and reservoirs, as well as the city-states, catchments, ponds, and rivers. Their presence can be seen and spotted across the island's estuaries too. Brackish places such as Sungai Buloh teem with cichlids of all colors, shapes, and sizes. Cichlids are also found among the wet spaces of Ni Soon Swamp, named after a pineapple king. These fishes even populate the most unassuming bodies of water. In 1961, the Singapore Botanic Gardens received from Malacca some cichlids known as St. Peter's fish for its Swan Lake. Most cichlids, between 70 and 80% of them, including St. Peter's fish, are indigenous to Africa, with the greatest diversity found in the Great Lake regions or the Great Lakes of Victoria, Tanganyika, and Malawi. Some cichlids are from the Americas too, and in particular the basins and drainages of the Negro and Amazon rivers. Since 1944, approximately 30 species of the cichlid family have been introduced to Singapore's freshwaters for purposes of food security, biological control, and the aquarium trade. Here are just a few. As a result, cichlids constitute a substantial share, nearly 20%, of Singapore's freshwater fish diversity. Among Singapore's many cichlids, there's one species that stands out for its role in making today's Indo-Pacific, the Mozambique tilapia, seen here. And this specimen and the previous specimens, they're all held at the Li Kongchen Natural History Museum. Wilhelm Peters, a German naturalist who served as director of the Berlin Zoological Museum, first described the cichlid species, this one seen here, in 1852, using a specimen he collected while on an expedition across Mozambique in the 1840s. Native to southern Africa, the Mozambique tilapia is arguably the most visible creature in Singapore's waters today. It seems, in many ways, to thrive in the Anthropocene in ways that other non-humans cannot. Its ubiquity has much to do with the fact that this fish can tolerate many things, from different water types, fresh, salty, brackish, turbid, and polluted, to different water temperatures. Coupled with its versatility and adaptability, this type of tilapia is wildly omnivorous, feeding on plants and animals. In turn, the most iconic Singaporean creatures feed on it, with the Mozambique tilapia forming an integral part of the diets of native predators, such as the smooth-coated otter, Malayan water monitors, dog-faced water snakes, and the estuarine crocodile. And yet, despite being a regular food source for Singapore's non-human residents, such as otters and crocodiles, and therefore critical to the production of local biodiversity, this wasn't the plan behind the introduction of the Mozambique tilapia to the island's freshwaters in 1944, or its subsequent travels from Singapore to other parts of the Indo-Pacific in the late 1940s and 1950s. This talk follows the travels of the Mozambique tilapia in a way that opens up a new kind of interaction for the environmental humanities, Asian studies, and I think transregional histories. It thinks with this particular fish species to show how and explain why its movements were central to the making of today's Indo-Pacific. In doing so, it shares a story about the little ways in which today's Indo-Pacific came to be, not as a geopolitical arena, or as a biogeographical zone, or even as a phenological province. And for historical reasons, it's worth pointing out, because I think Wikipedia gets this wrong, for historical reasons, it's worth pointing out that the Singapore resident and publisher J.R. Logan used and circulated the term Indo-Pacific in 1850 in relation to his ethnology work, making him perhaps one of the earliest folks to do so. By thinking with the Mozambique tilapia and its travels and human interlocutors, this talk explores how the Indo-Pacific came to be as a feral and patchy place. In using terms such as feral and patchy, I'm hoping to channel the insights of Anna Singh's collective and center a different kind of way of thinking about areas and regions, flows and circulations, infrastructures and technologies, cultures and histories, and ecologies and species. So what can we learn from a traveling history of the Mozambique tilapia? I would suggest we can learn quite a bit, because fish pay no attention to political boundaries. And just as fish move, so too do their stories, tangling and braiding worlds that once seemed unconnected or far removed. As the French social thinker Michel Desserteaux once remarked, quote, "What the map cuts up, the story cuts across." And as we'll see, hopefully, the story of the Mozambique tilapia cuts across lots of maps and genres, creating not only a different kind of connected history, but also a different kind of origin story about today's Indo-Pacific. So here's the outline. We're going to start in interwar Java. So my talk is organized around 4 chronological parts. We'll start in interwar Java, then we'll move to wartime Singapore. From Singapore, we'll expand into the post-war Indo-Pacific, and finally we'll end in the present day by way of Bambang Ramaharjo's idea of after effects. And I'll say more about him at the end. I'll think through these after effects through 3 Southeast Asian scientists who knew Mozambique tilapia in different ways. These different ways, I would argue, speak to the complexity of this particular fish and its resilient life in today's Indo-Pacific. So let's begin the interwar Java. Okay. So for me, the story of the Mozambique tilapia begins not in southern Africa in the 1840s, but instead in Java in the late 1930s. It's a fish tale that starts with Haji Mujair. He was born in 1890 and he died in 1957, rather than Willem Peters. Iwan Dalok, widely known as Pak Mujair, was from the village of Papungan in Blitar, a coastal region in East Java. Sukarno was also from Blitar, and he's buried there. Pak Mujair ran a popular satay kambing goat meat satay shop in the nearby town of Kanigoro, and when his business became profitable, Pak Mujair began to gamble, sadly, eventually losing his fortune and slipping into some really sad debt. As one member of his surviving family put it, quote, he was in a troubled spot, end quote. Pak Mujair then traveled, as most people do when you're in a troubled spot, Pak Mujair then traveled to the Kletak estuary for contemplation and ritual bathing, and quote, he saw a number of fish, end quote. Looking closer, he noticed that the fish carried their babies in their mouths when they were in danger, and then released them in safer situations. What Pak Mujair observed in the shallows of the Kletek estuary were fish practicing a kind of parenting behavior known as mouth brooding. And so out of 525 fish families, only cichlids and about 8 other families practice this mouth brooding. So it's a pretty rare thing. How these mouth brooders ended up in Java's brackish waters remains a mystery, and that's a totally different story. And that's not where we're going. But colonial experts at the time suspected that they were fugitive fish, that is, aquarium escapees. Sensing an opportunity and a possible solution to his dire financial straits, Pak Mujair returned to Papungan, his hometown, and experimented with culturing these fish in his backyard. After 11 attempts, as well as several trips back to the estuary for fresh specimens, he eventually was successful in keeping 4 of these curious mouth brooders alive in his home pond. In doing so, Pak Mujair had both, quote, discovered, end quote, and cultivated a new economic fish for East Java's backyard ponds, rice fields, and inland waters. This is his gravesite, and that's the marker that indicates this big achievement. So this achievement, this discovery, was recorded on 25 March 1936. Mujair's achievement in his marketing of this new economic fish to Papungan's residents soon caught the attention of the Dutch and Indonesian scientists who worked at the laboratory for inland fisheries in Bogor, Batenzorg. Failing to identify and determine the species of this new fish, these government experts named it Ikan Mujair, in honor of its local discoverer, Haji Mujair. Taxonomically, these scientists agreed, quote, it belonged to a species completely unknown to Indonesia, end quote. And after a short time, they began to circulate it, quote, under the name of Ikan Mujair. To be sure of its species type, specimens were then sent to the curator of ichthyology at the Natural History Museum in Leiden, a guy named Cummins, who identified Ikan Mujair in 1940 as a member of the cichlid family. His analysis was correct in determining the fish's family, but Cummins was a bit wrong in thinking about its species. He got the species wrong. He thought it was called Captain Zili, which is the St. Peter's fish. It wasn't. The identification of Ikan Mujair as the Mozambique tilapia, Oreochromis mozambicus, was only realized in 1947. This is Pak Mujair on the left, and then those are some government officials in the right. Taxonomy aside, Bogor's Dutch and Indonesian scientists continue to study, report, market, supply, and popularize this new farmable fish under the name of its Javanese discoverer, Pak Mujair, so Ikan Mujair. It even became so popular that Jim Collins included it in the Kamu Indonesia English book. So under the word kanal, to know, here's the example. That fish was introduced in Java by Haji Mujair. Not quite introduced, but more like made famous or discovered. And then here's the entry for Mujair in Jim's dictionary. Mujair, freshwater fish widely stocked in inland waters. Okay, great. By 1941, the multilingual press on both sides of the Straits of Malacca was popularizing Ikan Mujair because it grew fast, reproduced quickly, that's fecundity, and thrived in ponds and other systems of fish culture. In Indonesia, local newspapers ran stories that championed the adaptability of Ikan Mujair, saying it was one of the, quote, most suitable species for raising in rice fields. end quote. The pairing of fish and rice was more than just about the economics of culturing useful food in the archipelago. It was also about food security, as fish and rice constituted the daily diet of rural and urban populations alike. In Singapore, ikan mujair was touted as a new table fish that had the potential to become an important feature in Java's fish supply, just like what the freshwater sipat siam, which is a gourami from Thailand, did in Sulawesi. The supply and provision of ikan mujair and other proteins mattered greatly in 1941, and they mattered even more with the onset of World War II. So next section, wartime Singapore. The Japanese occupation marked a new chapter in Java's ikan mujair. Importantly, it created the conditions for these durable cichlids to travel out of Indonesia and into Singapore. In particular, the impact of the war on the food supply mobilized Japanese imperial networks to locate new kinds of edible fish for mass cultivation in ponds, lakes, rivers, fields, and farms. Java was quickly identified as a viable node in what would become a wartime web of biological transfers, with plants, animals, seeds, germs, and other nature-based materials crisscrossing Southeast Asia through Japanese scientific channels. In Indonesia, the popularity and success of growing ikan mujair in Javanese waters continued during the occupation. In August 1944, the Economic Affairs Department of the military government, headquartered in Jakarta, even authored a small pamphlet titled Perihal Ikan Mujair, about ikan mujair. This little book explained why ikan mujair were so vital to the, quote, world of fisheries in Jawa. Not long after this little publication, seen here, so this is the book here, and the first page has mujair on the inside, that's the fish. Not long after this little publication in October 44, the wartime fisheries conglomerate, Teikoku Suisen Tosai, the Imperial Fisheries Production Unit, secured from Java a stock of 123 ikan mujair for release in Singapore. These farmable fingerlings, small fish, were airshipped to the occupied colony for purposes of bolstering its battered protein supply. The introduction of these 4-inch fry, small fish, constituted a new beginning for ikan mujair that included not only a new home, but also a new name. No longer was this fish referred to as ikan mujair, but instead simply known as ikan tes, T-E-S, a local Malay name born from the initials of the enterprising Japanese firm that secured supplies of this industrious fish and then distributed them to Singapore's farming public. The enterprising Japanese firm was the local branch of the Teikoku Suisen Tosai. Flown to Singapore by Teikoku Suisen Tosai, I gotta get that right, these young ikan tes were raised to maturity at Tsui Pond, a government-supervised spawning ground in Kampung Potong Pasir. It's helpful to remember that in 1944, the Mozambique tilapia was not yet widespread in Singapore's freshwaters, nor was it found anywhere else in the Indo-Pacific. Outside of Java, and of course its home region in southern Africa, and perhaps even the Levant, because I think there are some sent there. This strange fish was only found in one other place, a single Singaporean pond off of Upper Serangoon Road in Kampung Potong Pasir. But just after 4 months of feeding, growing, and reproducing, what this fish does well, the stock of ikan tes had multiplied immensely. By January 1945, these Mozambique tilapias were made available to Singapore's public through a system of distribution that tapped into an older network of freshwater aquaculturalists who were mainly carp farmers, but whose supply of fry from China had been disrupted and were seeking alternative uses for their carp ponds. The novel presence of tilapia in Singapore created a fish buzz unlike anything before. As a, quote, new species of freshwater fish, end quote, ikan tes had the potential to transform rural and urban diets, from boosting the local fish supply to supporting the Grow More Food campaign. Wartime officials now saw an opportunity to turn the tide on matters of protein provisionment, high food prices, and the colony-wide fish problem. This optimism was based on the reproduction rate of the fish, the taste of the fish, and the adaptability of this tilapia. The local press reported that ikan tes reproduced very easily and rapidly, noting that the stock from Java had multiplied from 123 to roughly 10,000 in just 4 months. Naito Kanichi, the mayor of occupied Singapore and is director of the Food Control Department, Seki Yoshiko, led a group of reporters and officials on a tour of Tetsui Pond, where they met with Tsukamoto Jinjiro, the supervisor who cultivated an abundance of ikan tests in such a short period. Tsukamoto shared with his visitors the ikan tests were, quote, quite different from any other freshwater fish in Singapore. He also emphasized one important claim, which was often repeated through the kind of wartime government's propaganda channels, and that was ikan tests didn't taste like other freshwater fish, but in fact they were very tasty and most suitably prepared by frying. In addition to learning about the promise of this fish's high fecundity, its reproductive ability, and remarkable edibility, these Japanese officials emphasized that ikan tests was extremely adaptable. It could live and thrive in most kinds of aquatic habitats. From tin mines to coastal swamps, and from carp ponds to island rivers, no body of water was beyond the possibility of tilapia cultivation. From Tetsui Pond, tens of thousands of ikan tests were distributed across Singapore in 1945. The process of distribution was quite direct. Pond growers would receive coupons from the Food Control Department. In turn, they exchanged those coupons for a supply of young ikan tests free of charge. In order to receive a coupon, though, the pond farmer needed to provide the authorities with some data such as their name, their address, and the location and size of their ponds. They were also required to secure a permit from the Fisheries Department. Quote, owing to the difficulties in obtaining these permits, explained one post-war fisheries officer, few Chinese cultivators were able to participate in the ikan tests industry. In contrast, Malay communities were encouraged to integrate the farming of ikan tests within their new agricultural settlements. When new farms opened up in places such as Geylang Serai, or when older rubber estates were converted into food-producing zones like around Badok and Changi, the local press celebrated these wartime accomplishments because they included the mass cultivation of the island's newest freshwater fish. By March 1945, ikan tests were being raised in 42 ponds scattered across Singapore. One of these ponds was located in the West Coast Road area near where I live today and stocked with 5,000 fingerlings. Operated by a Japanese farmer, this well-planted pond was unfortunately built near the island's estuarine edge, so near the ocean, near the sea. As the rains came with the seasonal monsoon, flooding ensued, and a number of ikan tests escaped, becoming firmly established in the adjacent brackish waters. From one pond in Kampung Potong Pasir in 1944 to inhabiting nearly all of Singapore's fresh and brackish waters in 1945, the story of these cosmopolitan cichlids would experience yet another set of turns in the wake of World War II. So, the third part, post-war Indo-Pacific. The passing of the Japanese occupation marked the end of ikan tests, but the formal start of Mozambique tilapia. Ichthyologists in Bogor, London, and Amsterdam discussed and analyzed the ikan mujair specimens that were sent before the war and realized a correction was in order. With the help of the British Museum, the taxonomy of ikan tests was ultimately settled and clarified in 1947. This well-known fish was officially recognized as the Mozambique tilapia. Following this collaborative determination, nearly all subsequent sources on the travels and biology of this diasporic cichlid use its scientific name. Back then, Tilapia mozambica, today Oreochromis mozambicus, or they just refer to it by its more popular nomenclature, the Mozambique tilapia, or sometimes just tilapia for short. Even with its revised taxonomy and new name, the Mozambique tilapia was still out of favor among Singapore's public. While ponds and farms proliferated from Jurong in the west and Punggol in the east, there remained no appetite for tilapia. Much of this ill favorability was due to the return of carp from Hong Kong. The reappearance of carp in Singapore's Chinese-owned ponds signaled a resumption of inter-Asia trade. Ponds that had been repurposed for culturing tilapias during wartime now teemed with different kinds of carps and prawns. In addition to the carp and prawn factor, another blow to the economic life of these tilapias was the reemergence of seafood in local wet markets, with cooks and consumers once again able to buy familiar favorites such as ikan merah and ikan bilis. Here's a carp pond. The most telling reason for Singapore's distaste for the Mozambique tilapia was its late introduction to the protein supply. While efforts were made to distribute tilapia to pond growers across the island in 1945, these measures occurred in the waning months of the Japanese occupation. This late introduction, as well as the obstacles that Chinese carp farmers faced, meant that the island's primary freshwater aquaculturists were essentially tilapia-less. The Chinese farmers were tilapia-less. So the so-called miracle fish, that's what they sometimes called it, didn't have an opportunity to establish itself as a staple, much like it did in Indonesia. In this way, the Mozambique tilapia failed to live up to its economic promise during the island's wartime period, and as a consequence, struggled to become part of the provisionment of protein in the wake of the war. Despite its late arrival to the local food supply and the public's preference for tongko, kambong, and other marine fish, the fisheries department saw that Mozambique really was a promising economic species that could play an important role in the recovery of post-war Singapore. The capacity of this cichlid to adapt to different kinds of waters was welcomed as a timely solution to meeting society's growing food needs, particularly following a demographic surge on the, quote, land-hungry island. As one newspaper put it, fish were acceptable to all the races of multiracial Singapore. Under these circumstances, in late 1947, the fisheries department sought to increase the local protein supply by converting one section of a mangrove swamp into an experimental fish pond. This experimental fish pond was in Pasir Panjang, not too far from where I work and live today. Economically, this move to the island's estuarine edge had its advantages. There was an abundance of mangrove swamps that made the building of brackish ponds possible, which was believed to be ideal for farming Mozambique tilapia. Attuned to the public's preference, Malayan fisheries experts observed that the fish's usually earthy taste could be removed if they were cultivated under estuarine conditions. So a change in tilapia's taste, local experts hoped, would foster a change in its popularity and reception. By 1948, officials drained the government's test pond at Pasir Panjang and evaluated its aquatic residents. What surprised the scientists was the way in which the Mozambique tilapia, quote, dominated the brackish pond, end quote. They concluded that their experiments with culturing Tilapia mozambica in brackish ponds had produced, quote, phenomenal results, end quote. Despite such results and the perceived economic benefits of converting mangrove swamps into high-yielding tilapia fields or farms, the brackish pond at Pasir Panjang revealed something far more impactful. Mozambique tilapias were able to spread with ease beyond man-made enclaves and swampy farms and enter Singapore's native waterways. Shortly after the Pasir Panjang pond was drained and its faunal population examined, this brackish farm was restocked with more tilapia and other food fish in late 1948 as a second experiment. But in a predictable manner, seasonal monsoons arrived soon afterwards, and, quote, the whole of the southwest coast of Singapore was flooded on account of exceptionally heavy rains and high tides, end quote, reported one fisheries officer. This flooding served as a vector for countless tilapia, not only to flow into Singapore's estuaries, but also to establish themselves as feral communities in places such as Kuala Jurong. The experiment's results were ecologically clear. Brackish aquaculture, combined with extreme weather, created a direct pathway for Mozambique tilapias to make the island's native aquatic systems their permanent home. And here's a picture of that pond, the test pond on the west coast. It took less than a decade for these adventurous cichlids to become fully naturalized, happily feral, and widely common in Singapore. In 1953, a fisheries spokesman even confessed that nothing could really be done to change the fact that the Mozambique tilapia was abundant in Singapore, and growing more abundant by the day. For some, the island was, quote, already overpopulated with this fish. By 1954, Tom Alcao, seen here with the nice hat, a pioneering local scientist who worked for the fisheries department and then later was the founding director of the fisheries biology unit at the University of Singapore, and he was once the head of the primary production department. He was also the PhD advisor of Leo Tan, who was the first guy to get a marine biology degree in Singapore. So that's that guy. According to him, he summarized it quite well, the state of Singapore's tilapia population. These, quote, wonder fish, as he called them, were everywhere as farmed and feral species. Quote, there must be millions of tilapias in Potong Pasir and Paya Lebar, to mention just 2 places, end quote. The economic upswing for Tamakau's, quote, wonder fish laid not at home, but abroad. Faced with enormous production, Singapore became a trans-regional supplier of Mozambique tilapias in the late 1940s and 1950s. Whether cultured in brackish ponds or freshwater farms, or netted from wild estuaries, these cosmopolitan cichlids were mobilized to, quote, combat hunger in Asia, end quote, and foster development in the Pacific. Shipped to hungry markets in new waters, the Mozambique tilapia became embedded in local food cultures and protein supply chains, and in the process, established in native water systems. As a result, Singapore's wonderfish played a central, if forgotten, role not only in shaping the post-war rise of the Blue Revolution, but also in seeding the feral and patchy origins of today's Indo-Pacific. The early post-war period was especially mobile time for Singapore's tilapias, traveling as they did to feed the boom in mass aquaculture. One of the island's first tilapia exports was to Taiwan in 1946. Following the war, Wu Chenhui and Kwa Chi-cheng, 2 Taiwanese soldiers who served in the Japanese Imperial Army and were held in a POW camp in Singapore, returned to Kaohsiung with 13 tilapias that quickly grew to become, quote, a common fish in all parts of Taiwan. In 1950, Singapore sent tilapia fingerlings to Sabah, where they were introduced into local waters for the purpose of food production and biological control. They would eat weeds, water weeds, which would clog up irrigation canals, and often they were used to fight malaria, so they would eat on mosquitoes. And that's why they were used as a biological control. In that same year, Singapore relayed a tilapia shipment to St. Lucia in the West Indies. From St. Lucia, 400 of these Singapore sent tilapias were distributed to Jamaica, quote, where they established themselves and thrived, end quote. From Jamaica's supply of these Singapore sent tilapias, 103 were shipped to Haiti in 1951. And within 2 months of their introduction, they had, quote, multiplied by the hundreds, end quote. Singapore's tilapias were introduced to different parts of Asia too. In 1949, the island cichlids were sent to Penang, Kelantan, Terengganu, and Thailand. Thailand, in turn, shipped some of its Singapore-sourced tilapias to the Philippines in 1950. In 1951, Singapore sent roughly 2,500 tilapias to Sri Lanka, where they were planted in the ponds at the Fisheries Research Station in Colombo. And mainly, the reason for that was they wanted to populate the interior part of the country with fish ponds to offset any kind of lull in the marine production. So these fish in Sri Lanka, they multiplied so fast that several hundred times the original number and were taken to stock ponds elsewhere on the island. One fisheries expert at the time was astounded that this remarkable cichlid, quote, proved equally at home in fresh and brackish waters, end quote, and observed that soon thereafter they were readily attainable in the principal fish markets, end quote. From Ceylon or Sri Lanka, a consignment of fingerlings was sent to Madras, and from there, further into India. One of the greatest markets for Singapore's tilapias was the post-war Pacific. The first place in the Pacific to receive the island cichlids was Oahu, where we are now, where they were introduced in 1951 as a new source of food, as a new food source for humans and skipjacks, a kind of tuna, and also as a biological control against plants and mosquitoes in local canals and irrigation ditches. So you can think of the Alawai as a kind of daily reminder of this, which is today a home to all kinds of tilapias, or at least 2 that I know of, or that I've seen. A second shipment of Singapore's tilapias arrived. Oh, and I should just say about this map, because it's quite amazing. The triangle, boom, 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 boom. These are all the locations in the South Pacific where tilapia from Singapore or a second supplier were sent. And this was produced in 1964 by the South Pacific Commission, and you can just sort of see how dominant Mozambique tilapia was. Spanning the 1950s, these, quote, wonder fish cut across maps, cultures, ecologies, and really the very idea of area studies, which was being fashioned around the same time, as they moved out of Singapore and circulated among Apeli Ha'ofa's, quote, Sea of Islands. In 1954, Singapore's tilapias were introduced to the upland streams of Papua New Guinea, where they were trialed as a new food fish, cultivated for economic reasons, and then further distributed to other freshwater communities, thereby spreading the known reach but not yet known impact of this prolific species. Oh, that would have been my Hawaii picture. Sorry. Okay, so this is a Hawaii shot. Oh, I see. A second shipment of Singapore's tilapia. So it came in 51. A second shipment came in 52 to UH, and this is kind of a lab where that's being kind of done. And then I think I had this slide. Right. So spanning the 50s, these wonder fish cut across maps, cultures, ecologies, and the very idea of area studies. In 1954, Singapore's tilapias were introduced to the streams of Papua New Guinea. Okay, and then I think I go to here. That same year, in 1954, Singapore sent a tilapia shipment to Fiji. This particular delivery, which was to the Sigatoka Agricultural Station for its upstart piggery, would have a series of after effects that would play a shared part in sowing the feral and patchy origins of today's Indo-Pacific. While planted in a single pond in Fiji, a pond that was purposely built to feed pigs, these Mozambique tilapias quickly took to their new environment and rapidly reproduced, effectively transforming Sigatoka in Fiji into an inter-island supplier of Singapore's tilapias. From Fiji, batches of these cichlids were sent to the Cook Islands, Tonga, Western Samoa, Tonga Tapu in 1955. In that same year, 1955, a cargo of Mozambique tilapias was transported from Western Samoa to American Samoa. Also in 1955, the Philippines, having received its Mozambique tilapias from Thailand in 1950, who in turn got its fish from Singapore in 1949, became a supplier of these intrepid cichlids too. So the Philippines became a supplier. From Manila in 1955, shipments of Mozambique tilapias were sent to Saipan, Micronesia, Guam, and New Caledonia. And from these island places, additional freshwater habitats received by extension Singapore's wonder fish, spreading far and wide across Ha'ofa's Sea of Islands, but figuring too the Sea of Islands in new biological ways. Returning to Oahu, this little pulau was the source of introduction for tilapias entering the waterways of all the major islands of Hawaii in the years right after 1951, as well as to locations such as Washington Island and Fanning Atoll in 1958. So here, I'll just point out really quick, this is where they were first introduced in Fanning Atoll in 1958, and then on a survey in 78, these were the locations where they sort of spread, and these are some pictures of them. And then, I'm not sure if these fish particularly, but fish from this survey are now specimens at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology. By the end of the 1950s, Singapore's tilapia were everywhere. They populated and rapidly reproduced within a range of new environments, from mountainous rivers, coastal swamps, and traditional ponds, to urban canals, inland lakes, and native estuaries. But in traveling across regions and areas, and in the process transforming novel natures into permanent homes, these Mozambique tilapias gave rise to something new. They made possible a strange kind of Indo-Pacific, one genetically and even poetically rooted in the lives and afterlives of Haji Mujair's fish, while also ecologically and economically anchored in Singapore's post-war place as an island with countless tilapias to give. So now these after effects, this is kind of my attempt at concluding. By way of conclusion, then, I'd like to close my talk with a snapshot of after effects shared through 3 individuals who knew Mozambique tilapias in different ways at different times. And each of these ways, I feel, speaks to the complexity of this particular species and its resilient life today. So my use of after effects is borrowed from the Indonesian scientist Bambang Ranumiharjo, who I'll share more about shortly. So the first individual I want to talk about is Eric Alfred. First Alfred. So in 1961, Eric Alfred, the first Malayan-born director of the Raffles Museum and what would become the National Museum of Singapore, published a checklist of Singapore's freshwater fishes. He listed 32 fish species from 15 families. The last fish listed, number 32, was the Mozambique tilapia. And this was a first. No other Singaporean checklist had included the Mozambique tilapia up to that point. Importantly, Alfred described the fish rather than despised it, saying that this cichlid occurs in the feral state in some brackish and freshwater streams and ponds. So the after effect here is that tilapias, Mozambique tilapias, are Mozambique tilapias are part of diverse food webs, feeding on things just as things feed on them. So that's one present state of this fish. It's part of biodiversity. That's one after effect. The second is from 1971. This is from Domiciano Villaluz. In 1971, Domiciano Villaluz, a Filipino economic biologist who served as the founding dean of Mindanao State University's College of Fisheries in Marawi, and then later the inaugural head of CFDEC's aquaculture department in Iloilo. He was hired by the FAO in 1971 to investigate the possibility of aquaculture in the South Pacific. From July to October 71, Villaluz traveled to Fiji, Rarotonga, Tonga, Western Samoa, Pago Pago, Guam, Palau, Tahiti, and New Caledonia, among many other places. More than any other fish, he recommended the culturing of Mozambique tilapias, in large part because local stocks were available. So the after effect here is the push for mass aquaculture using Mozambique tilapias is often about food security and not biological diversity. So now the third after effect. Finally, Bambang. In 1979, Bambang Ranumiharjo, an Indonesian fish biologist who worked for the Brackish Water Aquaculture Development Center in Jepara, Java, was hired by the FAO to work in Nauru and implement the FAO's, quote, tilapia eradication program, end quote. Since their introduction to the country in 1960, Mozambique tilapias had gradually infested most of Nauru's ponds and lagoons, bodies of water that were central to the island's traditional aipia, or milkfish, industry. These tilapias were invasive, and they negatively impacted the vernacular relationships between fish and people. Using a laboratory at the local hospital, Bambang concocted a plant-based poison that aided the Nauruans in eradicating Tilapia mozambica from their island. He also advised that they could drain their ponds where possible and manually scoop out all the Mozambique tilapias and then turn those dead tilapias into feed or fertilizer. So the after effect here, not all Mozambique tilapias are invasive, but some invasives are Mozambique tilapias. And these invasive tilapias are causing not only species loss, but also the loss of cultural knowledge associated with these species. All right, that's all. Many thanks.
We do have time for questions. So, any questions for Dr. Medrano?
I hope that wasn't too long. I'm really sorry. I should have tried that out somewhere.
I'm going to preface my question with a statement. I don't know if everybody caught that one, but Fishtail was a great joke.
Yeah.
What's the future for tilapia in the world?
So I think
you mentioned Singapore is a food starved island, but isn't the world an island as well?
no, I don't think Singapore is a food starved. It's a land starved. It's limited. So they've been reclaiming land for like the last 60 years probably or longer. So it's growing, but it's a land starved, not a food starved. They do have a food problem. 80–90% of their food is imported. but they're pretty good with fish. Most people in Singapore, I think, eat seafood, so freshwater is not really, it's purely economic for export. But there are really there are no more tilapia farms. That's all back. That was back in the 50s. By the 60s, Singapore transformed radically, and that was tilapia farming and kelongs, these offshore platforms, that all disappeared. Yeah, and they put their money on shipping and transport.
Do you foresee growth in the future for the world? Tilapia farming?
So I think with tilapia, sort of as those after effects was trying to highlight, it's a really complicated question because it really depends where. It also depends a lot with species. So I'm trying to emphasize this is a Mozambique tilapia. This is very different than the Nile tilapia or the black chin tilapia or the other 3,000 types of tilapias. And each of those fish have different traits. That's what fish people call it, traits, which means they could adapt, they can live in salty water, they can die in salty water. That all varies depending on species and even hybrid. So I think I would say it's very nuanced and contextual. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, I was just wondering about that fish. I mean, it seems incredible that it would survive in so many different types of environment. Is that the only one that does that? You're saying some others will do it, but to shift from fresh water to salt water to brackish water and even to these mines.
Yeah.
So that is a wonder fish.
It's a wonder fish.
But that's the only wonder fish of the.
No, there's I think quite a number of tilapia
Will do that,
Yeah.
too.
So the black chin, which was accidentally released or introduced in Hawaii in 1965, that one is really cool with salty water. The Mozambique tilapia, it likes brackish water, but if it's like middle of the ocean, it probably won't last well there. So there's a certain salinity level threshold that it can entertain, and once you go beyond it, it'll probably die. But black chin, which is a species here, that likes it. So I think fish people, they've got like charts with salinity and sort of turbidity, the kind of the muddiness of the water and toxic levels, and they'll tell you which ones will make it. Yeah. So it varies again, but I think tilapia is pretty, as a family, it's pretty well known for being a hardy, durable.
And has it spread also to places that really need protein, and places like India, for example, and so forth and so on? Has that fish actually reached that area?
Yeah, definitely. So it was introduced in I think 51, 52 to Madras, to Chennai, and then from there, that was the headquarters of a big fisheries department. It spanned out. But tilapia today, I mean, this is kind of a history of how things came to be, but tilapia today is like one of the world's biggest aquaculture products. It's not, the fish that people grow today are largely not sort of pure species. They very much have been hybridized to reproduce in a certain period of time, to live in certain conditions, to feed on certain things. One of the problems with this particular species early on was that they would end up, they're a bit carnivorous. They'll eat their young, and so you had to balance between male and female and all kinds of factors. Because you could have a booming pond, and then all of a sudden it could collapse if they start to sort of eat out each other. So it's a really particular fish. Yes, Professor Dai?
Well, I was thinking, but when you mentioned at the beginning about the taste, tilapia, initially people didn't like the taste. And when you talked about India, being introduced to India, and then in Haiti,
Right.
there must be very different. So, is there a cookbook for tilapia? I mean, of how people change, not just fry.
Sure.
I mean, they have different sauces, they have different to make them appeal to local tastes.
So I don't, there must be, I'll look into this, I'll put it on my list. In Indonesia, especially in like Java, tilapia it's mujair there, and it is widely popular. They grow them in lots of places.
But cooked the same way?
Fried, but I think you can also get it saucy.
Coconut milk.
You can do
Coconut milk.
coconut milk. So but I think you're right. There might be some variation with how it's prepared. And I think the sticky thing with Singapore, they said it was earthy. People do say that it's earthy, but they also just really didn't like it because it was associated with the Japanese, and it had sort of trauma embedded in it. And they also, as you know, Singapore was always a kind of seafood country. It wasn't really a fresh, unlike the Philippines, unlike Indonesia or the interior part of Malaysia. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, sir.
Well, I just want to answer her question about that because I'm from aquaculture. So actually, there's many cookbooks for tilapia.
Oh, great.
And then you mentioned about the fish from Singapore getting to Taiwan, and I didn't catch up with the name of those two gentlemen.
I can send you
But
the names, yeah.
but actually, it's kind of different from what we understand because in Taiwan, we're using the two gentlemen. The last name, one is Wu, one is Guo.
Okay.
So that's what we named it Wu Guo. That's the way we say. But you
That's-
say like a Chen or something like that. Right?
No, the names that you just mentioned,
Wu Guo.
those are the two guys that
Yeah,
brought it
they
from
brought
Singapore,
it Singapore.
and their name
Yeah.
became
So we
associated
just
with fish.
named them under that.
Mm.
And the fish is really, wonderful. I think the gentleman asking about what's the future of aquaculture for the tilapia. Before in the US, back here, people don't want it, right? Because from Hawaii, right? But in the US now, actually, right now, on the top 10 most consumed fish. So there's potential there.
Costco sells it,
Yeah.
in these huge bags.
Yeah.
It's a very popular fish, you're right.
Then I have a question for you.
Okay.
I just wonder, first, like when I saw the title you're going to present, I just wondered why you choose the tilapia. What's the motivation, the reason behind for you to study the history of the tilapia?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I got to it because I was really interested in Indonesia first. And I knew this name, and I knew there was a story there, but I hadn't really seen much talked about it. And then I just, so really it was coming from an Indonesian history point of view. That's kind of how I started. And I followed the Indonesian and Dutch sources, and that led me to Singapore's leg of the story. And then in Singapore, I lived there, so I was able to investigate things there. And so I think it just kind of was, to be honest, I like to find things that kind of create a new way to see stuff. And I think the tilapia, even if you're not into fish, I don't even eat fish, so even if you're not into fish, even if you're not into fish, it's an exercise in how can we see the past differently, and how can we see these fields through a new lens. So the field of science and ecology, history and culture, and even religion, right? Haji Mujair going down to do his religious bathing. I'm always searching for a way to bring that kind of story together through some new lens.
I see.
So that was for me the tilapia. It was a vehicle.
I see. But have you looked into, when you're from the anthropology, so kind of look and say, are you going to talk about how tilapia relate to human cultural activity and so on?
No, I'm gonna. My big thing was to reimagine it for us, or to kind of lead you on a imaginative exercise of how can we think about the Indo-Pacific differently, not geopolitically, not biogeographically, but as this strange place created through the movement of this crazy fish. And that's why I was more interested in its journey, because it allows us to see Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Pacific, all these area studies in a kind of through a new perspective.
Yeah. Sorry, I might occupy too much. Another thing that
Yes.
talking about tilapia, because we have one of the wonderful scientists behind there do all the basic study. But tilapia, I don't know how many people know it. The skin, you can use the skin to
For
make
burns.
it growth, right?
Oh, right, yeah.
The scale, you make it corneal. I'm pretty sure much better than the things that too.
Okay.
So it's just
Wow, it's an amazing fish, no doubt. Wonder fish indeed.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Can I bring you back into geopolitics?
Oh, sure.
In some ways, even though you said you didn't want to.
Yeah.
But I study agriculture and the role of Singapore Botanic Garden and the Kew, the UK basically. The colonial history about distribution of plants, and they usually kind of like starting from the Botanic Garden and going to their colonies. And when you're going down the list, Jamaica, sort of like Sri Lanka, these were all the colonies, but not all of them were the British colony. And so I was wondering, what were the entities in Singapore that, because in the beginning you mentioned about the distaste that Singaporeans had, and
Yeah.
yet this fish was just exploding or needed to get rid of them.
Mm-hmm.
So were they like individual farms, or were they some entity that actually improved on this, like the Botanic Garden work on tea or rubber and distribute? Do you have any
Yeah,
insight
so-
about the Singaporean agency that took care of this?
So in Singapore, there was a real big disconnect. The market didn't want the fish. The government wanted to grow more fish, and these things weren't aligned. And so you had people incentivized by the government to grow fish, to grow tilapia, but they kept on complaining, so they were like these cooperatives, these associations, business associations. These tilapia farmers kept on complaining to the fisheries department, we're growing this fish, we're using money to grow this fish, but nobody is buying this fish. And so, but the government was convinced, no, but it's a very good economic fish. If you keep growing it, we'll get the market there, we'll get the market there. It never happened. The market never emerged. So the disconnect was government and market. And these growers, they were all independent growers, but they were organized as a kind of, like a lot of things in Singapore, everything has an association. So it was like a kind of tilapia farmers association, and they lobbied and advocated for something to do. They needed an outlet for all this fish that they had invested in. And so yeah, that's how it happened. That's why in 48, it starts to go outward.
Singapore was still a British colony at the time, right?
Yeah,
Oh,
always, yeah, up till 65.
Yeah, time for maybe one more question?
Okay, sure. Hito, maybe you can ask, if you don't mind too, how about just, yeah, sorry, Hito and then the gentleman in the back.
Well, just following on that, I had just a question about when you talk about export, but with a fish that's just reproducing at a rate that it does, the supply and demand kind of structures really don't work for an export model, right? Like because they can just grow in all the places that you've already exported to. So I'm just wondering, like, did you follow like the economics, like the prices, like did they fluctuate once they started like really increasing in other kinds of places? And at the end you were talking about this conflict between between biodiversity and sort of food security, like you sort of hinted, right? So like, did that play into the different kinds of patterns? You said different places had different contexts in which these debates sort of emerged. Was it where there was an oversupply versus an undersupply? So just a little bit about the economics.
Sure. I haven't looked too much at the economics of it, but I would the analogy that I could think of is Ukraine's wheat is part of the World Food Program. Ukraine supplies a huge part of its wheat to the World Food Program. Singapore's tilapia were part of the FAO. And so it was a kind of contribution to the FAO, then it was distributed out. So that was the relationship. I don't know what the pricing was, but I mean, I just gave a sort of sampling of where it went, but they really were going all over the place. Yeah, so that's on the economics, and then on that tension between food security and biodiversity, or biological diversity, no, I don't think folks really thought of that at all in the 50s or 60s. That was, I mean, the term biodiversity doesn't even emerge until the 80s. So, yeah, so that wasn't yet part of the conversation. Yeah, and then the last question, the way back. Yes, you, sir.
Okay, cool. I was just wondering, did the black chip tilapia also have a similar journey? Because there's like tons of them here.
Yeah.
So did other species also follow with the Mozambique in the hybridization? Or was it mainly the Mozambique that got spread? And the others kind of by accident?
So I don't really know a lot about the black chin tilapia. I know that in the Philippines they call it Isda Arroyo, named after the president GMA, because it has a black mole on it, like the way GMA does. So they call it the Arroyo fish. It was accidentally introduced, but it's a much freakier fish because it's super hardy. So when there was a recent study published by some scientists here at UH about like 2 weeks ago, I think, and it was about climate change and the impact that climate change will have on native and endemic fish species in Hawaii, which, like in Singapore, those native and endemic fish species tend to live in very upstream cold water, far from warmer areas. But with climate change, and there's a natural barrier that separates the cold water habitat and the warm water habitat. There's a natural barrier, so warm water things won't go up. But with climate change, they think that that cold water in Hawaii will get warmer, and as a result, it's going to open that barrier so that the black-chin tilapia most likely will be able to move up, which will be pretty disastrous probably for the endemic fish. That's all I can say about that one. I don't really know a lot about it though. Sorry. All right, thank you all for listening to me.
Let's continue the conversation over some wine and cheese. And we didn't find, I really wanted to find tilapia.
No.
It's smoked ahi, so maybe the ahi ate the tilapia. And
Oh,
And
right.
shrimp crackers.
And shrimp crackers.
We have non-alcoholic drinks too. Please come get
Wasn't
some
made
drinks.
for tuna.
Nathan, thanks for